This is Don with HoustonGarageFloors.com. This is probably one of the worst concrete slabs I've ever seen in my entire life. Check out this concrete. Look how soft it is. You can just like write your name in it if you want to. It's got either a layover or it's got a scab from being overworked after it started drying. So sometimes, these are layovers actually, because you got multiple layers. This is actually right here, the original. They worked it over, which means that after it started drying, they took a machine and smooth troweled it and worked it until it created a scab. But that was just in order to disguise the excessive amount of water they added to the concrete slab, which saved them money, but it in return made the concrete slab weak. So kind of like adding too much water to pancake mix, it creates pockets of air, which results in brittle concrete. And then they came over here and tried going over it with a layover. Concrete has really no adhesion strength. It just kind of sits on top of whatever you put it on. So you're better off grinding this, exposing the brittle concrete, and then putting down a slow drying, low viscosity resinous sealer like epoxy so it can go down deeper and grip onto it. Now, granted, I'm not going to be able to guarantee that the concrete stays stuck to itself. I mean, putting a coating over brittle concrete isn't magic. It's not going to turn this into a super duper hard surface. But when you use resin and you thin it down a lot, it's going to go deeper and harden more of it than concrete, which just sits on top. So imagine taking a sandbox and trying to epoxy over it. The epoxy isn't going to turn the sand into concrete. It's a far analogy, but it kind of helps you understand the situation. So, but you know, if you want to get a coating, which is this, like the customer wanted to get a coating because they're bringing so much concrete dust into the house. As long as you have the conversation with the customer and they realize that putting a coating over it isn't going to magically turn the slab into a brand new slab, as long as you're honest with them and they understand the difference between a coating not sticking to concrete and coating that sticks to concrete, breaks apart with concrete still stuck to the back of it, as long as they realize that's not really the coating's fault, that's the coating did what it was supposed to, it stuck to what it was supposed to, then you can move forward and just do the best you can, which would be grind past this, scrape it up, grind past this, get to the soft, blow it off, vacuum it off, get all the residual dust off, and then use a really low viscosity epoxy primer that dries slow. You don't use polyaspartic because it would dry too fast. Thin it down with a lot of xylene or acetone, like at least 25%, so that it goes down deep and penetrates and prevents it from drying too quickly, because you want something to go as deep as possible for the best anchor possible. So we got a lot of oil stains here. The customer was like sweeping the slab up, and it was just breaking apart. So this is probably the worst I've ever seen. So let's see what we can make this slab look like later. Wow, look at that. You could dig a hole. This is soft concrete. This is soft. If you can, like, when people ask me, is my concrete hard or soft, and if they're on the phone, what I ask them is, if you can take a screwdriver and write your name in it, or dig a hole, then it's soft. If you can't, this is harder, then that's soft too. This is horrible. Wow. Now let's get started scraping and grinding. So we're going to put down a primer. The primer is going to seal the pores and prevent the next coat from bubbling. So your primers, you don't want to put down super thick. Primer is designed to be put down anywhere between 5 and maybe up to 12 mils thick, but typically 5, 6, 7, 8 mils thick. And putting it down thin allows it to penetrate deeper. If you put the coating down, the first coat on a porous concrete slab with a lot of product, the product will actually stay in, will not want to soak in. It will stay attracted to itself. Imagine taking pancake syrup and then pouring it onto a table. The pancake syrup is attracted to itself. You take pancake syrup and pour it into a bead and then another bead of pancake syrup, and once they touch, you notice they start coming together. So the same principle applies on primers. You don't want it too thick because it's going to stay stuck to itself and not penetrate. Now, some people will purposely put down primers thick in order to save themselves money because it levels it out quicker with less product if they just put it down thick. That's why a lot of these concrete guys, these coating guys, will use concrete layovers because it saves them money. So what we're going to do is do it right, and we're going to take the 3 gallons of product, the 3 gallons of epoxy, and we're not going to just put the epoxy down by itself. We're going to add a significant amount of acetone to it. We're going to throw more money at this. We're going to add 25% acetone, which is 3 quarts, on top of the 3 gallons of epoxy. And what that's going to do is going to lower the viscosity. It's going to make it thinner. And I don't mean thinner as in thick or thin. I mean lower the viscosity. I don't really like the term thinner when we're talking about viscosity, because people think, oh yeah, you're putting it down thinner in this matter. So I like to say lower the viscosity instead of thinner. So if I take 3 gallons of epoxy and I put it down on this floor versus 3 gallons with 3 quarts of acetone, after it dries, they're the same exact thickness. Now, if I add that thinner with design, if I add that thinner like I'm going to, it's going to allow it to go deep, which is good for the customer because this concrete slab is so porous that we need the epoxy to go down deep inside of it and act like an anchor so that it doesn't just pop off like this old stuff was doing. So the deeper the anchor, the better adhesion. This is day 2. This is 2 coats of primer. Let's check it out down low. Take a look. Now Tay did an excellent job at throwing chips into this. So we did some practice chip throwing. That's why we got chips on the primer. We wanted to take advantage of the time and the fact that we had a primer down. And this is the very first time he's ever thrown a partial chip floor. Partial chip floors are very difficult to learn. It took me about 20 floors before I was able to get to this level without throwing chips and clumps. So what happens is you throw a handful too heavy, just one handful too heavy, you get in a hurry and you get a clump. And then the floor is ruined essentially because you have to catch up with it and fill in the rest of the floor with enough chips to match. So you have to be very patient when you're doing partial chip floors. Use 3 fingers and throw up. Don't throw down, don't throw sideways, throw up. Get to the point where you're a few inches away from hitting the ceiling. The higher the better, because the higher the chips go, the further they're gonna distribute, and on the way down, they're not gonna be in a clump. So you've got like high ceilings, it's easier to do a partial chip floor. But we had like, check this out, we had a typical, I don't know, it's an 8 foot, I guess. And he was able to do, I would call this a medium plus distribution of chips. A lot of people would call this heavy. I don't like calling this heavy because our heavy chip floor is actually totally saturated. So, you know, unfortunately, these terms are ambiguous. There's no set formula on what to call what. So some people will sell you a heavy chip floor, but it actually looks like this. So make sure that you understand, you know, the difference between a full saturation and a partial chip floor. This is a partial chip floor. It's partially distributed chips. We do offer this with epoxy. You can't do it with polyaspartic because polyaspartic dries so quickly you don't have enough time to distribute the chips in a uniform manner. It takes about half an hour at least to do this. So kudos to Dave, first time doing this, really nice. So what we're gonna do is, so if you look closely, you'll see that you've got chunks of floor, the layover that busted up and was thrown around while we were rolling, and it's in the floor. So we're gonna have to either scrape the floor by hand, which would take forever, or take a floor buffer with 36 or 12 grit paper and sand the floor. And you've also got like mosquitoes or mosquito eaters. So this is the problem with epoxy. The major problem with epoxy is it takes so long to dry that it absorbs junk from the air, dust, your neighbor's leaves, pine needles, which is why the chips are necessary. If you think that you can do a solid gray floor without having junk in it, you know, think again, because it doesn't happen. It's not possible. There's always going to be junk landing on the floor if you do a solid color floor without chips. The chips are there in order to disguise the flaws. That's why we put chips on floors originally. And it's called a homogeneous texture, visual effect, and it takes your attention away from the flaws and makes it look uniform, so you don't notice the flaws, the waves, the junk in the floor. So we don't do solid color floors without chips. Now there's companies that do it, typically commercial companies who aren't really concerned about aesthetics. If you got some junk in the floor, it's a warehouse, who cares, it's gonna wear it down anyway. But if you do a solid color floor without chips, you need to be very clear with the customer and let them know, you know, honest expectations. Because some people will like notice like, you know, little flaws and they'll never be satisfied. And so you really need to be doing a chip floor in a garage unless they really understand and they really understand what's going to happen. So what you can do is, if you don't want to do chips, you can add sharp grit, which is like sand, into the floor coating, and that will help give you a homogeneous texture, visual texture, and help deflect away from the flaws. Sharp grit's really cheap. It's like 20 bucks. It's like basically a plastic form, a very hard plastic form of sand, basically. And it flows to the surface and gives you a little bit of like a sandpaper-like look. And that's great for non-skid surfaces. If you need extra traction, you can add that to your clear coat. You don't really need that with the chip floor because the chips are the texture. But if you do a solid color floor without chips, you really need to consider using sharp grit because it's going to be slippery one way. If there's kids, if there's a pool, if there's water, they can slip. So you need to take that into consideration. But if I did do a solid color floor, I would definitely use sharp grit. If not for the sake of slip resistance, then solely just for the sake of visual appearance, because that sand, that sandpaper-like look is going to help deflect away from flaws. Now, you're not going to get chunks of floor on a typical floor. You know, this is the worst concrete slab I've ever seen in a garage that I've done work on. So this was actually, when we were rolling, the floor concrete was breaking apart and getting thrown around. So we're gonna take 36 grit or 12 grit sandpaper and go over this whole floor, knock that down, and then we're gonna proceed with our system, which is gonna be polyaspartic at 10 mils thick, and gray saturated with chips, scrape it, and then 10 mils of clear polyaspartic on top of it. We're gonna sand next. So we just got here after Armin scraped and vacuumed the floor, and it looks awesome. Now we've got some places like this where either Bondo or high chunks of concrete were knocked off. This happens sometimes. Typically it's not this bad, obviously, because of the nature of this slab. We're gonna have more of them, so no big deal. There's an easier way to fix it. Just take your clear polyaspartic, clear, don't use colored, and then lightly go over it, and then sprinkle some chips on it. Let it dry, 20 minutes or so, scrape it, and then you're gonna continue with your system on top. You're gonna clear coat the whole floor afterwards. So I'm gonna go around and clear coat these spots, sprinkle it, and then let it dry and scrape it, and then we'll clear coat the floor and check it out afterwards. So before you clear coat, you remove the tape off the walls. The reason you do that before you clear coat is because if there's any missing spots underneath the trim, you want to know that now before you clear coat. Like for example, this spot right here, we're gonna go ahead and get that. Also, when you're done with the clear coat, you want to just leave. You don't want it to come back and wait 2 hours and then walk on the floor, you know, and take the tape off. There's no reason to walk on the customer's brand new floor if you don't have to. You want them to be the one that breaks the seal. So take the tape off before you clear coat.